My name is Virginia Wells, and I'm 85 years old. I've got arthritis in my fingers. My hearing isn't what it used to be, and sometimes I forget where I put my glasses. But there's one thing I'll never forget. The day I realized the man I married wasn't a hero at all. It was 1973, and I was 26 with dreams bigger than my small hometown of Millfield, Ohio could hold. The Vietnam War was finally winding down, and our boys were coming home. Some came back whole, others carried invisible wounds that ran deeper than any battlefield scar. I thought I understood that then. Lord knows, I had no idea. I met him at a church social in downtown Millfield. Picture this: a handsome man in dress blues, chest decorated with ribbons and medals that caught the light every time he moved. When he smiled at me across that crowded fellowship hall, my heart did little somersaults like a schoolgirl's. He had this way of looking at you that made you feel like you were the only person in the room. Dark hair, strong jawline, and eyes that seemed to hold stories I desperately wanted to hear. "Ma'am," he said, approaching with that confident stride that military men perfect. "I don't suppose you'd honor me with a dance?" The way he said it. So formal, so respectful. My mother had always told me to look for a gentleman, and here was a genuine war hero asking little old me to dance. The band was playing something slow and sweet, and when he pulled me close, I caught the scent of his aftershave mixed with something else. Something I couldn't quite place then, but would recognize years later as the smell of secrets. During those first few months of courtship, he'd tell me stories about Vietnam. Not the gruesome details. He was too much of a gentleman for that, but enough to paint himself as someone who'd seen hell and come back to protect others. He'd served 2 tours, earned a Purple Heart, and had commendations for bravery that made my chest swell with pride. This man had risked everything for his country, and somehow, miraculously, he'd chosen me. "Virginia," he'd say during our evening walks through downtown Millfield, "a man needs something pure to come home to, something untouched by all the ugliness out there." The way he'd look at me when he said things like that, I felt like I was glowing from the inside out. We married 6 months later, in a ceremony that the Millfield Gazette covered. "Local girl marries war hero." That was the headline. I still have that clipping somewhere, though I haven't looked at it in decades. In the photo, I'm beaming in my mother's wedding dress, while he stands tall and proud in his military uniform. If you look closely at that picture, you might notice something I missed then. His smile never quite reaches his eyes. But I was head over heels in love, drunk on the romance of it all. Here was a man who'd fought for freedom, who'd bled for his country, who'd chosen me out of all the women he could have had. My friends were jealous, my family was proud, and I felt like the luckiest woman alive. The first year of marriage was, it was what I thought marriage should be. He'd bring me flowers for no reason, hold my hand during movies, and tell me I was beautiful even when I'd just rolled out of bed with my hair looking like I'd been struck by lightning. He was protective, almost to a fault. He didn't like me walking alone after dark, insisted on driving me everywhere, and got genuinely upset if other men so much as looked at me too long. "I just want to keep you safe, sweetheart," he'd say, and my heart would melt all over again. "I've seen what this world can do to good people. I won't let anything happen to you." When I got pregnant with Tommy in early 1974, he was over the moon. He'd talk to my belly for hours, telling our unborn son about honor and duty and what it meant to be a real man. He'd already started planning our boy's future: military school, then service to his country, following in his father's footsteps. I remember thinking how lucky our child would be to have such a devoted father, a real role model. But even then, there were little things. Tiny cracks in the perfect picture that I explained away because I was so desperately in love with the idea of who I thought he was. He'd sometimes wake up in the middle of the night, drenched in sweat, and calling out names I didn't recognize. When I'd try to comfort him, he'd push me away, sometimes harder than necessary. "Just nightmares," he'd mumble, but he'd never let me hold him through them. And during the day, he'd act like nothing had happened at all. There were moments when his protectiveness felt different, less like love and more like control. But I pushed those thoughts away. This was a war hero, a man who'd sacrificed for others. If he seemed a little intense sometimes, well, that was just because he'd seen things that would break lesser men. I felt honored that he trusted me enough to let his guard down, even just a little. Tommy was born in October 1974, a perfect, healthy baby boy with his father's dark hair and my stubborn chin. The first time his daddy held him, I swear I saw tears in those steel-gray eyes. For a moment, just one perfect moment, I thought we were going to be the happiest family in the world. I had no idea that in just a few years, I'd be running for our lives. The move to Buffalo happened so fast it made my head spin. One day we're living in our cozy little apartment in Millfield, and the next thing I know, my husband's announcing he's found us a real home 3 states away. A place where we could raise Tommy properly, he said, away from prying eyes and small-town gossip. Trust me, Virginia, he said, folding me into his arms while Tommy gurgled happily in his bassinet. This is our chance for a fresh start, just the 3 of us. The way he said, just the 3 of us, should have sent chills down my spine. But I was still so caught up in playing the perfect military wife that I convinced myself this was romantic. My husband, my war hero, wanted us all to himself. How could that be anything but love? The house he'd found was, well, calling it a fixer-upper would be generous. It sat on 15 acres of overgrown land about 20 miles outside Buffalo, so isolated you couldn't see another building from any window. The nearest neighbor was almost 2 miles away. The realtor kept apologizing for the condition. Peeling paint, sagging porch, windows that rattled in their frames like chattering teeth. But my husband walked through that place like he was touring a palace. He'd run his hands along the walls, test the floorboards, and nod with satisfaction. Solid bones, he kept saying. Good bones. What struck me most was the basement. It was bigger than our entire apartment back in Millfield, with thick stone walls and a heavy wooden door that creaked like something out of a horror movie. The previous owners had used it for storage, but it felt different down there. Cold. Even in the middle of summer, I needed a sweater just to go down and do laundry. Look at this space, my husband said, his voice echoing off the walls. A man could really think down here. No distractions. I remember Tommy started crying the moment we brought him down there. Just started wailing like something was hurting him, even though he'd been perfectly happy upstairs. My husband took him from my arms and walked to the far corner, bouncing him gently. He'll get used to it, he said. But there was something in his voice, something that made my stomach clench. The first few months in that house were like living in a strange dream. We were miles from anyone, completely dependent on each other. My husband loved it. He'd come home from his new job at the Veterans Center and just, I breathe, like he could finally relax. No one bothering us out here, he'd say, pulling me close on the front porch while Tommy played at our feet. No busybodies asking questions or trying to tell us how to live our lives. But isolation does things to people. Things I didn't understand then. It started with little comments. Nothing that would alarm anyone else, but they stuck to me like burrs on a sweater. When I mentioned maybe getting a part-time job once Tommy was older, he'd shake his head with that patient smile. Why would you want to work, sweetheart? Your job is here, taking care of our family. Besides, you don't know these people around here. They're not like the folks back home. When I suggested joining the church in town, maybe finding some friends, he'd get that distant look in his eyes. Churches are full of gossips, Virginia. People who think they know better than a man about his own family. Slowly, so gradually I barely noticed, our world got smaller and smaller. We stopped going anywhere that wasn't absolutely necessary. He did all the shopping, said it was easier that way. He'd bring home groceries, stamps, anything I needed from town. Saved you a trip, he'd say, and I'd thank him like he'd done me some great favor. The phone calls to my family back in Ohio became less frequent. At first, he'd just hover nearby when I talked to my mother, not saying anything but listening, making me feel self-conscious about every word. Eventually, it was easier to just make the calls shorter, then skip them altogether. Your mother worries too much, he'd say when I'd mention calling home. Why upset her with every little thing? Better to let her think we're doing fine out here. And we were doing fine, weren't we? We had this beautiful house. Okay, it needed work, but still, plenty of land, and each other. Tommy was growing like a weed, babbling and trying to walk and being absolutely perfect. My husband was attentive and loving, always quick with a compliment or a gentle touch. But the nightmares were getting worse. He'd wake up thrashing, sometimes shouting orders like he was still in Vietnam. "Get down! Get down!" he'd scream, and I'd shake him awake, my heart hammering against my ribs. He'd look at me for a moment like he didn't recognize me, his eyes wild and unfocused. Then he'd grab me, not gently, hard enough to leave marks that I'd cover with long sleeves the next day. "You can't sneak up on a soldier like that," he'd say, his voice shaking. "You could have been killed." I started sleeping lighter, listening for the change in his breathing that meant the dreams were starting. Sometimes I could wake him before they got bad. Sometimes I couldn't. The worst part was Tommy's reaction. Even as a baby, he seemed to sense when Daddy's nightmares were coming. He'd start fussing hours before bedtime, like he knew something bad was going to happen. And when my husband would wake up screaming, Tommy would cry inconsolably for hours afterward. "That kid's too sensitive," my husband would mutter, pacing the living room while I tried to soothe our son. "Boys can't be crying every time there's a little noise. He needs to toughen up." Tommy was barely 2 years old. But during the day, everything seemed normal again. My husband would kiss me goodbye before work, ruffle Tommy's hair, and tell us both how much he loved us. He'd bring home little gifts, flowers from someone's garden, a toy truck for Tommy, candy bars he'd picked up at the gas station. "Just because," he'd say with that charming smile that had swept me off my feet back in Millfield. I kept telling myself that the isolation was temporary. Once we got settled, once he felt more comfortable, we'd make friends. We'd have people over. Tommy would have playmates. I had no idea that my husband had very different plans for our future. And I certainly didn't know that the basement, that cold, echoing basement that made Tommy cry, would soon become the center of our nightmare. Please, my dear, tell me in the comments, which town are you watching from? And what time of the day did you find this video? Are you having your morning coffee or exercise, or perhaps resting after lunch, or just chilling in your bedroom at night? I'm happy to know where you're from, and when you take out time to listen to this grandma's stories, and please don't forget to subscribe to this channel because our voice matters. Tommy turned 3 in October of 1977, and that's when everything started changing in ways I couldn't ignore anymore. My little boy had grown into this curious, energetic child who asked a million questions and wanted to explore everything. He'd run around our big yard, chasing butterflies and making up stories about the trees being giants and the rocks being sleeping dragons. But his daddy was starting to see that curiosity as something that needed to be controlled. "Boys need structure, Virginia," he'd say, watching Tommy play from the kitchen window. My father understood that. Discipline builds character. I'd grown up in a household where discipline meant a stern talking to, or maybe losing dessert privileges. But my husband's idea of discipline was different. It started small, making Tommy sit perfectly still at the dinner table for longer and longer periods. No fidgeting, no talking unless spoken to, no getting up even if he'd finished eating. "A soldier learns patience," my husband would say, standing behind Tommy's chair like a drill sergeant. Patience and obedience. At first, I thought it was just father-son bonding. Maybe this was how military families did things. What did I know? I'd grown up with sisters, and my father had been gentle as a lamb. Maybe boys really did need firmer guidance. But then came the day Tommy spilled his milk at breakfast. It was an accident. Any parent could see that. Tommy was reaching for his toast, his little elbow knocked over his cup, and milk went everywhere. He looked up at his father with those big, innocent eyes and said, "Sorry, Daddy, it was an accident." The silence that followed felt like the air before a thunderstorm. Heavy, electric, dangerous. My husband stood up slowly, his chair scraping against the floor with a sound that made my skin crawl. He walked around the table to where Tommy sat, milk dripping off the edge onto the floor, and just stared down at him. "Soldiers don't make accidents, son. They make mistakes. And mistakes have consequences." "But Daddy, I didn't mean to." "Stand up." The way he said it, cold as January wind. Tommy scrambled out of his chair, and I could see his little hands shaking. My heart was pounding so hard I thought it might burst right out of my chest, but I didn't know what to do. This was his father. Surely he wouldn't. You're going to clean this up, every drop. Then you're going to sit in the basement until I decide you've learned your lesson about being more careful. The basement? I finally found my voice. Honey, he's just 3 years old. Maybe we could just… The look he gave me could have frozen fire. Are you questioning how I discipline my son, Virginia? My son. Not our son. My son. Tommy started crying then. Those big gulping sobs that broke my heart into 1,000 pieces. I don't want to go to the basement, Daddy. It's scary down there. Please, I'll be more careful, I promise. But my husband was already picking him up, carrying him toward the basement door, despite Tommy's struggles and pleas. I followed, my legs feeling like jello, watching my baby reach for me over his father's shoulder. Mama, Mama, don't let him take me down there. The basement door opened with that awful creaking sound, and cold air rushed up to meet us. My husband flicked on the single bare bulb that hung from the ceiling, casting harsh shadows on the stone walls. He set Tommy down on the bottom step. You'll stay here until dinner time, he said. No crying, no calling for your mother. Think about what you did wrong and how you can do better next time. Tommy was sobbing so hard he could barely breathe. Daddy, please, I'm sorry. I'm really sorry. But my husband was already walking back up the stairs. He stopped at the top, looked back down at our terrified child, and said, A real man owns his mistakes, son. This is how you learn. Then he closed the door and turned the lock. I stood there, staring at that locked door, listening to Tommy's muffled cries from below, and felt something break inside me. This wasn't discipline, this was. I didn't even have a word for what this was. He's just a baby, I whispered. He's my son, my husband replied, heading back to the kitchen like nothing had happened. And he needs to learn respect. I wanted to unlock that door. Every instinct I had as a mother was screaming at me to get my child out of that cold, dark basement. But the way my husband had looked at me, the warning in his voice when he'd asked if I was questioning him, I was scared. Scared of my own husband in my own house, and that realization hit me like a physical blow. For the next 6 hours, I paced that house like a caged animal. I could hear Tommy crying for the first hour, then calling for me, then silence. The silence was somehow worse than the crying. I kept creeping to the basement door, pressing my ear against it, praying I'd hear something that meant he was okay. My husband spent the day acting like everything was perfectly normal. He read his paper, watched television, even complimented me on the pot roast I was making for dinner. Meanwhile, our 3-year-old son was locked in a basement for spilling milk. When dinner time finally came, my husband unlocked the door and called down, Tommy, come eat. The little figure that climbed those stairs barely looked like my energetic boy. Tommy's face was streaked with tears, his clothes were dirty from sitting on that cold floor, and he was shivering like a leaf. But the worst part was his eyes. They looked older somehow, like something innocent had been stolen from him in those 6 hours. He didn't say a word during dinner, just ate his food in tiny, careful bites and kept glancing at his father like he was waiting for the next punishment to fall. That night, after my husband went to sleep, I slipped into Tommy's room. He was lying awake, staring at the ceiling, his stuffed rabbit clutched tight against his chest. Mama, he whispered when he saw me. Am I bad? I gathered him in my arms, breathing in that sweet little boy smell of his hair. No, baby, you're not bad. You're perfect. Then why did Daddy lock me in the scary place? I didn't have an answer for that. How do you explain to a 3-year-old that sometimes the people who are supposed to protect us become the very people we need protection from? I don't know, sweetheart, I whispered against his hair, but Mama's going to make sure it doesn't happen again. Even as I said it, I knew it was a promise I might not be able to keep, because that night, lying in bed next to my sleeping husband, I realized something that terrified me more than anything else. This was just the beginning. The milk spilling, the basement, Tommy's frightened eyes. This was my husband showing me what he was capable of. And if he'd do this over spilled milk, what would happen the next time Tommy made a mistake? I stared at the ceiling until dawn, listening to my husband's steady breathing, and tried to figure out when the man I'd married had become a stranger. When had those protective instincts turned into something darker? When had love become control? Most importantly, how was I going to protect my son from his own father? The basement punishments became as regular as Sunday church used to be. By the time Tommy turned 4, I could predict them like weather patterns. A dropped toy, talking back, not sitting still during his father's war stories, anything could trigger what my husband called lessons in discipline. But it was the rules that really showed me how far we'd fallen into this nightmare. My husband started writing them down, posting them on the refrigerator like some twisted family charter. House rules for growing strong men, he called it. I can still recite them from memory, burned into my brain like a brand. Rule 1. Speak only when spoken to. Rule 2. Clean up your messes immediately. Rule 3. Rule 4. Boys don't cry. Crying is for the weak. Rule 5. Obey your father without question. Rule 6. Time in the basement builds character. Every time I looked at that list, my stomach would tie itself in knots. These weren't rules for a 4-year-old child. These were rules for breaking a spirit. Tommy tried so hard to follow them, watched his every move, weighed every word before speaking, became this careful, anxious little boy who jumped at sudden sounds. The confident, giggling child who used to chase butterflies in our yard was disappearing piece by piece. The worst part was watching him try to please his father. He'd bring my husband his slippers, ask permission to use the bathroom, apologize for things that weren't even his fault. My heart broke a little more every day, watching my baby walk on eggshells in his own home. Look how well-behaved he's becoming, my husband would say proudly, like Tommy's fear was some kind of achievement. Structure works, Virginia. My father knew that. I started to understand that this wasn't just about Tommy. My husband was recreating something from his own childhood, some twisted version of what he thought love and discipline looked like. But understanding it didn't make it any easier to watch. The basement stays got longer. What started as a few hours for spilled milk became half-day punishments for forgetting to say, "Yes, sir." Then full days for crimes like leaving a toy where someone might trip over it. I'd pace the house during those long hours, listening for any sound from below. Sometimes I'd hear Tommy talking to himself, making up little stories or singing songs we'd taught him. Other times, there was just that terrible silence that made me wonder if he'd fallen asleep on that cold floor, or worse. My husband installed a lock on the outside of Tommy's bedroom door, too. Boys need to learn boundaries, he explained when I questioned it. They need to understand that privileges are earned. So now, bedtime became another form of control. If Tommy had been good that day, he got to sleep in his bed. If not, he spent the night locked in his room with nothing but a blanket on the floor. I tried talking to my husband about it once. Just once. It was a Sunday morning, and Tommy was in the basement for the crime of asking for seconds at breakfast. Greedy boys become greedy men, my husband had said, scooping up Tommy like a bag of flour. Don't you think we're being too hard on him? I asked carefully, scrubbing dishes with more force than necessary. He's still just a little boy. My husband looked up from his newspaper, and the temperature in the room seemed to drop 10 degrees. Are you questioning my judgment again, Virginia? No, I worry sometimes about what all this discipline might do to him. He folded his paper with deliberate precision and stood up. When he walked over to where I stood at the sink, every instinct I had told me to run. But where could I go? This was my home, my husband, my life. Let me tell you something about discipline, he said, his voice quiet but deadly serious. My father raised me right, taught me respect, obedience, how to be a real man. And look how I turned out, served my country with honor, came home to take care of my family. His hand settled on my shoulder, fingers digging in just hard enough to make his point. Tommy's going to thank me someday for making him strong, for teaching him that the world doesn't coddle weak men. But he's not weak, I whispered. He's just a child. Exactly. Which means there's still time to shape him properly. His grip tightened. Unless his mother undermines that training by being soft. The threat was clear as crystal. Question him again, and the consequences wouldn't just fall on Tommy. I nodded and went back to my dishes, hating myself for being such a coward. But what choice did I have? We were miles from anyone, completely isolated, with no car of my own and no money he didn't control. Even if I could get us away, where would we go? What would we live on? Besides, he was Tommy's father. Didn't fathers have rights? Wasn't this just a different parenting style? Maybe I was overreacting. Maybe this really would make Tommy stronger. These were the lies I told myself to get through each day. But then came the incident with Mrs. Patterson. Mrs. Patterson was our nearest neighbor, an elderly widow who lived about 2 miles down the road. She'd stopped by one afternoon when my husband was at work, bringing us a basket of apples from her tree. "Haven't seen much of you folks since you moved in," she said kindly, accepting my invitation for coffee. "Thought I'd check on you, see how you're settling in." Tommy was in the living room, playing quietly with his trucks, always quietly now, always aware that too much noise meant consequences. Mrs. Patterson watched him for a while, her weathered face thoughtful. "He's a serious little thing, isn't he?" she observed. "Most 4-year-olds are chattering non-stop, bouncing off the walls. He's just well-behaved," I said, but even to my own ears, it sounded wrong. Mrs. Patterson leaned forward, lowering her voice. "Honey, I don't mean to pry, but is everything all right here? That little boy seems awful scared for a child in his own home." For a moment, just one moment, I almost told her everything. About the basement, the locks, the rules, the way Tommy flinched whenever his father raised his voice. The words were right there, pressing against my lips like caged birds desperate to fly. But then I heard my husband's truck in the driveway. "Everything's fine," I said quickly, standing up to clear the coffee cups. "We're just still adjusting to country life." My husband walked in all smiles and charm, shaking Mrs. Patterson's hand and thanking her for the apples. But I caught the way his eyes moved between her, me, and Tommy, calculating, measuring, filing away details. After she left, he was quiet for a long time. Then he turned to me with that patient smile that no longer fooled me. "Nice lady," he said, "but nosy. We'll have to be more careful about unexpected visitors." The next week, he installed new locks on all the doors and put up a gate across our driveway. "For security," he explained. But I knew better. We weren't just isolated anymore. We were imprisoned, and Tommy was about to learn that his father's idea of discipline was about to get much, much worse. Winter came early to Buffalo that year. By November 1978, snow was already piling up against our windows, and the wind howled through the gaps in our old house like something wild and angry. But the cold outside was nothing compared to the ice that had settled into our home. Tommy was 5 now, and the light in his eyes had dimmed to barely a flicker. He moved through the house like a ghost, speaking only when spoken to, never running or laughing anymore. My beautiful, curious boy had learned that being noticed meant being punished, so he'd made himself as invisible as possible. The basement had become his second bedroom. Some weeks, he spent more time down there than in the rest of the house combined. My husband had moved an old army cot down there, along with a metal bucket that I tried not to think about too much. "Self-sufficiency builds character," he'd say when I protested. "My son needs to learn that comfort is earned, not given." But it was getting colder. Even with the furnace running, that basement was like an icebox. Stone walls, concrete floor, one bare bulb. It wasn't fit for storing furniture, let alone a child. I'd sneak extra blankets down there when my husband wasn't looking, but he always found them and took them back upstairs. "Coddling makes weak men," he'd lecture, bundling up the blankets. "Tommy needs to learn that life is hard. Life is hard." As if a 5-year-old needed that lesson beaten into him day after day. The morning it all came crashing down started like any other. My husband left for work at the Veterans Center, kissing my cheek and ruffling Tommy's hair like he was Father of the Year. Tommy had been good the day before, meaning he'd sat perfectly still during dinner and hadn't asked for anything, so he'd been allowed to sleep in his real bed. "I'll be home by 6, my husband said, straightening his tie. "We're having pot roast tonight, and I want Tommy to practice sitting at attention during dinner. He's getting sloppy with his posture." After he left, Tommy and I had a few precious hours of normal. I let him help me make cookies, and for just a little while, I saw glimpses of the boy he used to be. He giggled when he got flour on his nose, licked the spoon when I wasn't looking, and asked me about a million questions about how cookies got crispy in the oven. But around noon, disaster struck. Tommy was playing with his toy soldiers in the living room. CTO, quietly, always quietly, when he accidentally knocked over my husband's coffee mug from that morning. It was sitting on the side table, forgotten, with just a little bit of cold coffee in the bottom. The sound of that mug hitting the hardwood floor was like a gunshot in our silent house. Coffee splashed across the wood. The mug rolled under the couch, and Tommy just stood there frozen, staring at the mess with those wide, terrified eyes. "Mama," he whispered, his voice shaking. "I didn't mean to. It was an accident." I was already moving, grabbing paper towels and rushing to clean it up. "It's okay, baby. We'll get it cleaned up before Daddy gets home. He'll never even know." But even as I said it, I knew it wouldn't matter. My husband always knew. He'd examine that living room like a crime scene investigator, and somehow he'd figure out what happened. He always did. We spent the afternoon scrubbing that floor until it gleamed. I moved furniture, used wood polish, even lit candles to mask any lingering coffee smell. Tommy helped, his little hands shaking as he wiped down the baseboards over and over again. "Do you think he'll notice, Mama?" Tommy asked for the 10th time. "No, sweetheart," I lied. "Everything looks perfect." But when my husband walked through the door at 6 o'clock sharp, it took him exactly 3 minutes to figure out what had happened. He stood in the living room, hands clasped behind his back, eyes scanning every surface like a detective. Then he walked over to the side table and ran his finger along the edge, where a tiny splash of coffee had left the faintest stain. "Tommy," he said quietly, "come here." My son walked over on legs that could barely hold him up. I wanted to throw myself between them, to grab Tommy and run, but my feet felt like they were nailed to the floor. "Did something happen in this room today?" Tommy's eyes darted to me, then back to his father. I could see him weighing his options, tell the truth and face punishment, or lie and face worse punishment when the truth inevitably came out. I knocked over your coffee cup, sir," he whispered, "but Mama and I cleaned it up real good. We made it all better." My husband nodded slowly, like Tommy had just confirmed something he already knew. "I see. And what does Rule #2 say about messes?" "Clean up your messes immediately," Tommy recited, his voice barely audible. "And did you clean it up immediately?" "Yes, sir. We cleaned and—" "No." The word cracked like a whip. "You hid it from me. You and your mother conspired to deceive me about what happened in my house." I found my voice. "He's just 5 years old." He was scared. Scared? My husband's laugh was like broken glass. "He should be scared. Fear keeps boys from making stupid mistakes." He turned back to Tommy. "But lying to your father, that's worse than any broken cup. What happened next still haunts my nightmares." My husband picked Tommy up and headed straight for the basement door. But this time felt different. This time, there was something in his eyes that made every alarm bell in my head start screaming. "Please," I begged, following them. "It was just an accident. He didn't mean to." "Go to your room, Virginia," my husband said without turning around. "This is between me and my son." "No, I won't let you." He spun around so fast it made me dizzy. "You won't let me what? Discipline my own child? Parent my own son?" His voice was getting louder with each word. "You're the reason he's weak, always protecting him, always making excuses." Tommy was crying now, those silent tears that broke my heart. "Please don't put me in the scary place, Daddy. I'll be good. I promise I'll be good." But my husband was already carrying him down those stairs. This time, when the door closed and the lock clicked, I didn't pace the house like usual. I sat right outside that basement door and listened. For the first hour, I could hear Tommy moving around down there, probably trying to get comfortable on that awful cot. Then I heard him talking to himself, maybe telling himself stories to stay brave. Then, as the hours passed and the house got colder, I heard something that made my blood run to ice. Silence. Complete silence. It was after midnight when I couldn't stand it anymore. My husband was asleep. I could hear him snoring from our bedroom, so I crept to the basement door and pressed my ear against it. Nothing. No movement, no breathing, no little boy sounds at all. "Tommy?" I whispered through the door. "Tommy, are you okay?" No answer. My hands were shaking so hard I could barely work the lock, but somehow I managed to turn it quietly and crack open the door. Cold air rushed up to meet me, and I realized the furnace must have gone out hours ago. "Tommy?" I called softly, starting down the stairs. What I found at the bottom nearly stopped my heart. My baby was curled up on that cot in a tight little ball, completely still. His lips were blue, his skin was gray, and when I touched his face, he was like ice. I don't remember screaming, but I must have, because my husband came thundering down those stairs like the world was ending. All I know is 1 second I was alone with Tommy's lifeless body, and the next, my husband was pushing me aside, his face white as death. "What did you do?" he hissed, but his hands were already moving, checking Tommy's pulse, lifting his eyelids, pressing an ear to his chest. "What did I do?" The words came out like broken glass. "I found him. Oh God, he's not breathing right. And he's so cold. And, shut up!" He scooped Tommy up in his arms, and for one terrible moment, I thought my baby was gone. Just gone. 5 years old and frozen to death in his own basement because his father thought love meant cruelty. But then Tommy made a sound, a tiny, gasping sound like a newborn kitten. My husband ran up those stairs faster than I'd ever seen him move, carrying our son to the bathroom where he started the shower running hot. Steam filled the room as he climbed right into that shower, still fully dressed, holding Tommy against his chest. "Come on, son," he was saying, his voice cracking in a way I'd never heard before. "Come on, wake up for Daddy." I stood in the doorway watching the warm water cascade over both of them, watching my husband rock our unconscious child and whisper apologies that came too late. The confident war hero, the man who always knew what was right, looked small and terrified and completely lost. It took 20 minutes for Tommy to really wake up. 20 minutes of the longest terror I'd ever experienced, watching for signs of life in my baby's gray face. When his eyes finally fluttered open and he started shivering, actually shivering, which meant his body was trying to warm itself, I nearly collapsed with relief. "Mama?" His voice was barely a whisper, hoarse and confused. "I'm wet." "You're okay, sweetheart," I sobbed, reaching for him. But my husband pulled away. "I've got him," he said, but something had changed in his voice. The authority was gone, replaced by something that sounded almost afraid. We spent the rest of the night in the emergency room at Buffalo General Hospital. I sat in that harsh fluorescent waiting room, still in my nightgown and winter coat, while doctors examined Tommy for hypothermia and frostbite. My husband paced like a caged animal, his wet clothes slowly drying, his hands shaking every time a nurse walked by. "How exactly did this happen?" Dr. Martinez asked, when he finally came out to talk to us. He was young, probably new to dealing with cases like this, but there was something in his eyes that told me he suspected more than we were saying. My husband stepped forward, all charm and authority again. "Tommy's been having trouble sleeping lately. Sometimes he wanders around the house at night. We think he went down to the basement and fell asleep on the old cot down there. The furnace went out sometime during the night." It was a perfect lie. Reasonable, believable, the kind of thing that could happen to any family. But Dr. Martinez looked at Tommy, who was awake now but clinging to me like his life depended on it, and I saw doubt flicker across his face. "Has Tommy ever wandered before?" he asked me directly. I opened my mouth to answer, felt my husband's hand settle on my shoulder, not comforting, warning, and heard myself say, "Sometimes. He's always been curious." Dr. Martinez nodded slowly. "Well, he's going to be fine. No permanent damage, though it was close. A few more hours and—" He didn't finish that sentence, but we all knew what he meant. On the drive home, nobody spoke. Tommy dozed fitfully in the back seat, wrapped in hospital blankets, while my husband stared straight ahead at the dark road. I kept turning around to check that Tommy was still breathing, still there, still alive. When we pulled into our driveway, my husband sat in the car for a long moment before turning off the engine. "This doesn't leave the family," he said quietly. "What happened tonight? It was an accident. A terrible accident that won't happen again." I stared at his profile in the dashboard light. "Won't happen again because you won't lock him in the basement anymore?" The silence stretched between us like a chasm. "The basement is off limits until I can get better heating down there," he finally said. Not, "I'll stop using it as punishment," not, "I was wrong." Just, better heating. The next few days passed in a strange, quiet truce. Tommy stayed close to me, hardly speaking, jumping at every sound. My husband went to work and came home and ate dinner and watched television like nothing had happened. But I caught him staring at Tommy sometimes, and there was something different in his eyes. Not regret, exactly, but uncertainty. For the first time since we'd moved to that house, I started to see cracks in his absolute confidence. 3 days after the hospital visit, while my husband was at work, I did something I hadn't done in months. I called my mother in Ohio. "Virginia! Oh, honey, it's so good to hear your voice. How are you? How's that precious boy of yours?" Just hearing her voice, warm, familiar, loving, broke something open inside me. I started crying before I could stop myself. "Mama," I whispered into the phone, "I think I'm in trouble." "What kind of trouble, sweetheart? Are you hurt? Is Tommy hurt?" The whole story came pouring out of me like water from a burst dam. The isolation, the rules, the basement punishments, Tommy nearly freezing to death. Everything I'd been holding in for years spilled across the phone lines to my mother's horrified silence. When I finished, she was quiet for so long I thought the line had gone dead. "Virginia," she finally said, her voice shaking with fury I'd never heard before. "You get that baby and you come home. Right now. Today." "I can't, Mama. We don't have any money. And the car, I'll wire you money. I'll drive out there myself if I have to. But you cannot stay with a man who nearly killed your child. He didn't mean for it to go that far. He was just trying to discipline." "Stop." My mother's voice cut through my excuses like a blade. "Stop making excuses for him. A man who locks a 5-year-old in a freezing basement isn't disciplining. He's torturing." The word hit me like a physical blow. Torture. That's what we'd been calling discipline all this time. "But he's Tommy's father," I whispered. "A father protects his children. He doesn't terrorize them." After I hung up, I sat at the kitchen table, staring at that list of rules still hanging on our refrigerator. House rules for growing strong men. Tommy's childhood had been sacrificed to those rules, and I'd let it happen. I'd been so afraid of my husband's anger that I'd forgotten my job was to protect my son. But my mother was right. This wasn't discipline or character building or any of the things my husband called it. This was abuse. And it was getting worse. That afternoon, I started making plans. Quiet plans, careful plans, the kind of plans a woman makes when she knows her life depends on not getting caught. Because I'd finally realized something that terrified and freed me at the same time. If I didn't get Tommy away from his father, my husband was going to kill him. Maybe not on purpose, maybe not all at once, but piece by piece, day by day, he was destroying my beautiful boy. And I would rather die trying to save him than live watching him disappear. The war for my son's life was about to begin. Planning an escape when you're being watched every minute of every day is like trying to breathe underwater. Everything has to look normal on the surface while you're drowning underneath. For 2 weeks after that phone call with my mother, I played the perfect wife. I cooked my husband's favorite meals, agreed with everything he said, and never once questioned his discipline methods. Meanwhile, I was studying him like my life depended on it, because it did. He left for work at 7:30 sharp every morning, came home at 6:15 every evening, never deviated from his routine. Saturdays he went to the VFW hall from noon to 4 p.m. to drink beer with other veterans and tell war stories. Sundays we went to the tiny country church about 10 miles away, where he played the role of devoted family man while Tommy sat between us, silent and still as a statue. I started hiding things. A $20 bill here and there from the grocery money, Tommy's birth certificate from the file cabinet, my mother's old address book with phone numbers of relatives in different states. Small things that wouldn't be missed right away, but might save our lives later. The hardest part was watching Tommy continue to shrink into himself. Without the basement punishments, my husband had found new ways to break our son's spirit. Hours of standing at attention in the corner, meals withheld for imaginary infractions, bedtime stories replaced with lectures about what real men do. "Stop sniveling," he'd snap when Tommy so much as sniffled. Crying is for weaklings and women. Tommy had learned not to cry, but I could see the tears he was swallowing, choking on his own emotions, until I worried he'd forget how to feel anything at all. Then came the Saturday that changed everything. My husband had gone to the VFW as usual, and I was in the kitchen making lunch when I heard a sound that made my heart stop. Laughter. Real, genuine, 5-year-old laughter coming from the backyard. I looked out the window and saw Tommy chasing our neighbor's cat around the old oak tree. The cat would dart behind the trunk, Tommy would peek around one side, the cat would dash to the other side, and Tommy would dissolve into giggles. For just a moment, he looked like the little boy he used to be. That's when I noticed the man standing at our property line. He was tall, probably in his 60s, wearing work clothes and a concerned expression. When he saw me watching from the window, he raised his hand in a tentative wave. I dried my hands on my apron and stepped outside. "Ma'am," he called out. "I'm Roy Patterson, from down the road. I think we met once before, but it's been a while. Mrs. Patterson's nephew. She'd died the previous winter, and I'd heard through church gossip that her family was settling her estate." I walked over to the fence line, Tommy trailing behind me like he always did when strangers appeared. "I'm sorry for your loss," I said. "Your aunt was a kind woman." "She was indeed." Roy's eyes shifted to Tommy, who was hiding behind my legs. "She mentioned you folks a few times. Worried about you, actually." My stomach clenched. "Worried?" Roy glanced around, as if checking to make sure we were alone. "Look, I don't mean to pry, but Aunt Helen said some things before she passed. About your little boy seeming scared, about not seeing you folks around much anymore." I felt Tommy's grip tighten on my skirt. "We keep to ourselves mostly. My husband prefers privacy. I understand that. But Helen, she was a teacher for 40 years before she retired, had an eye for children who were struggling." Roy's voice was gentle but persistent. "She asked me to keep an eye on you if anything ever happened to her." For a moment, I almost told him everything, almost grabbed this stranger's hand and begged him to help us. But then I heard the sound of my husband's truck in the distance, coming home early from the VFW. "Everything's fine," I said quickly, scooping Tommy up. "Thank you for your concern, but we're perfectly fine." Roy studied my face for a long moment. Then he reached into his pocket and pulled out a piece of paper. "If you ever need anything at all, here's my number. Helen made me promise to give it to you." I took the paper, my hands shaking slightly. My husband's truck was getting closer. "I have to go," I whispered. "Mrs." Roy paused, realizing he'd never gotten my last name. "Just remember, Helen cared about you both. And so do I." I rushed Tommy inside just as my husband's truck pulled into the driveway. He came through the door in a foul mood, smelling like beer and cigarettes, and something else I was beginning to recognize as barely controlled rage. "Who was that man I saw walking away from our property?" he demanded. My heart hammered against my ribs. "Mrs. Patterson's nephew. He was settling some of her affairs." "What did he want?" "Nothing important. Just introducing himself as the new neighbor." My husband's eyes narrowed. "I don't like strangers sniffing around our business. What did you tell him?" "Nothing. Just that we were sorry for his loss." He stared at me for what felt like hours, searching my face for signs of deception. Finally, he seemed to accept my explanation, but the tension in his shoulders didn't ease. That night, after he'd gone to sleep, I lay in bed, staring at Roy Patterson's phone number by the light of my bedside clock. 10 digits that might represent salvation or destruction, depending on whether I was brave enough to use them. The decision was made for me 3 days later. I was folding laundry in our bedroom when I heard my husband's voice from downstairs, sharp with anger. "Tommy, get over here. Now." I crept to the top of the stairs and saw my son standing in front of his father, shoulders rigid with fear. On the floor between them lay the broken pieces of one of my husband's military medals, the Purple Heart he'd earned in Vietnam. "Explain this," my husband said in that deadly quiet voice that meant real trouble. I was just looking at it, sir. It was so pretty, and I wanted to see it better, but it slipped and you touched my medals without permission. I'm sorry, Daddy. I'm really, really sorry. I didn't mean to break it. Sorry doesn't fix what's broken, does it, son?" I started down the stairs, my legs feeling like jelly. Honey, it was an accident. He's just curious about his father's service. Stay out of this, Virginia. My husband's voice stopped me halfway down the stairs. This is about respect, about understanding that some things are sacred. He walked over to the closet and pulled out something that made my blood freeze in my veins. A belt. A thick, military-issue leather belt that he'd never used for anything but holding up his pants. Until now. No, I breathed, but the word came out as barely a whisper. Real discipline, my husband said, folding the belt in half. The kind my father used on me, the kind that actually teaches lessons. Tommy was backing away, tears streaming down his face, but there was nowhere to go in our small living room. Please, Daddy, I'm sorry about your medal. I'll be good. I promise I'll be good. You will be good, my husband agreed. After you learn what happens when you disrespect your father's service to this country. That's when I did something I'd never done before in all our years of marriage. I ran down the rest of those stairs and put myself between my husband and my son. No, I said, louder this time. I won't let you hit him. The look my husband gave me could have melted steel. Move aside, Virginia. No. For a moment, we stared at each other across a line I'd never dared cross before. 5 years of fear and submission and making excuses for the inexcusable. And finally, I'd found something worth fighting for. My husband raised that belt, and for a terrifying second, I thought he was going to use it on me instead. But then, Tommy's sobbing broke through our standoff, and something in my husband's face changed. He lowered the belt slowly, but his eyes never left mine. Get him out of my sight, he said quietly. Both of you. Before I do something we'll all regret. I grabbed Tommy and ran upstairs to his room, my heart pounding so hard I thought it might explode. Behind the locked door, I held my shaking son and tried to process what had just happened. I'd defied him. For the first time in our marriage, I'd stood up to the man who controlled every aspect of our lives. And now, there would be consequences. That night, as my husband's snores echoed through the house, I made my way to the kitchen phone and dialed Roy Patterson's number with trembling fingers. Hello? His voice was groggy with sleep. This is Virginia, I whispered. From up the road. You said if I ever needed anything. Are you in immediate danger? I don't know. Maybe. My husband, he almost. And Tommy's just 5 years old, and I don't know what to do. Listen to me very carefully, Roy said, and suddenly, he didn't sound sleepy anymore. Do you have somewhere safe you can go? My mother. In Ohio. But I don't have money for bus tickets, and my husband controls everything. That's not a problem. Can you get to the Greyhound station in Buffalo? I think so. Maybe. But what if he finds us? What if... One step at a time. How soon can you be ready to leave? I looked around our kitchen, at the house that had become our prison, at the refrigerator still displaying those awful rules. How soon is too soon? I whispered back. The plan we made in those desperate midnight minutes would either save our lives or destroy them completely. There was no middle ground left. The next morning felt like walking through a minefield blindfolded. Every movement had to look normal, while my heart hammered against my ribs like a caged bird fighting to get free. My husband left for work at his usual time, kissing my cheek and patting Tommy's head like nothing had happened. But I caught the way his eyes lingered on me, calculating and suspicious. He knew something had shifted between us. The question was whether he'd figure out what before we could get away. Roy Patterson had been clear about the timing. I had one shot at this. One day, when my husband would be away long enough for us to disappear before he could track us down. And that day was today, Wednesday, when he always stayed late at the Veterans Center for his weekly counseling sessions with other Vietnam vets. I might be late tonight, he'd said over breakfast, confirming what I'd prayed for. Got some paperwork to catch up on. Those sessions usually kept him until 8 or 9 in the evening. If I timed everything perfectly, we'd have a 6-hour head start before he even knew we were gone. After his truck disappeared down the road, I ran to Tommy's room where he was playing quietly with his toy soldiers, the only toys he had left that hadn't been confiscated for various infractions. Tommy, sweetheart, I said, trying to keep my voice calm and normal. We're going to play a game today. He looked up with those serious, too old eyes. What kind of game, Mama? We're going to pretend we're going on an adventure, to see Grandma in Ohio. But it has to be our secret, okay? Just between you and me. Tommy's face scrunched up in confusion. What about Daddy? My heart nearly broke at the question. Despite everything his father had put him through, Tommy still loved him, still wanted his approval, still hoped, in that way children do, that maybe tomorrow Daddy would be different. Daddy's going to meet us later. I lied, hating myself for it, but knowing the truth would only confuse and terrify him more. I'd already packed our few belongings into 2 small suitcases, just the essentials, nothing that would be missed if my husband came home early. Tommy's favorite stuffed rabbit, a few changes of clothes, the money I'd been hiding, our identification papers, everything else we'd have to leave behind. Roy Patterson had arranged everything with military precision. A taxi would pick us up at the end of our long driveway at 2 p.m. sharp. The driver would take us to the Greyhound station in Buffalo, where tickets to Columbus, Ohio would be waiting under my maiden name, Virginia Matthews, a woman who hadn't existed for 5 years. At 1:45 p.m., I stood at our living room window watching the road, Tommy's hand clutched in mine. He was wearing his best clothes and carrying a small backpack with his rabbit tucked inside, trusting me completely even though he didn't understand why we were leaving everything he'd ever known. Are we really going to see Grandma? He asked for the 10th time. Yes, baby, we really are. Will she remember me? I was little when we moved away. She'll remember you. Grandmothers never forget their grandsons. The taxi appeared right on schedule, a yellow car that looked like a chariot of freedom pulling up to our gate. My hands were shaking so badly I could barely turn the locks my husband had installed to keep the world out and us in. Come on, Tommy. Time for our adventure. We ran down that driveway like our lives depended on it, which they probably did. The taxi driver, an older black man with kind eyes, helped us with our bags without asking questions. He'd clearly been briefed by Roy about the situation. Buffalo Greyhound Station? He confirmed. Yes, please. And could we take the back roads? Avoid Main Street? He met my eyes in the rearview mirror and nodded. Whatever keeps you safe, ma'am. The 40-minute drive to Buffalo felt like the longest journey of my life. Every car that passed us, every siren in the distance, every red light made me certain my husband had discovered we were gone and was somehow tracking us down. Tommy dozed against my shoulder, exhausted from the emotional weight he didn't fully understand, while I watched the familiar landscape of our prison fade away behind us. The Greyhound station was exactly as terrifying and hopeful as I'd imagined. Crowds of travelers, announcements echoing off concrete walls, the smell of diesel fuel and desperate dreams. I'd never felt so out of place or so free in my entire life. Roy Patterson was waiting by the ticket counter, just as he'd promised. When he saw us, his face broke into a smile that actually reached his eyes, something I'd almost forgotten existed. Right on time, he said, handing me an envelope. 2 tickets to Columbus, departing at 4:20. Your mother's address is written inside, along with some cash to get you started. I can't take your money, I protested, but he was already pressing the envelope into my hands. Aunt Helen left specific instructions in her will: money for emergencies, especially ones involving children who needed help. He knelt down to Tommy's level. You take care of your mama, okay, son? Tommy nodded solemnly. Are you a good guy or a bad guy? The question hit Roy like a physical blow, and I saw him understand instantly what my child's world had become, a place where you had to identify threats immediately to survive. I'm one of the good guys, Roy said gently, and so are you. Our bus was already boarding when we heard it, the sound that turned my blood to ice. A vehicle screeching into the station parking lot, tires squealing against asphalt, a car door slamming with the force of barely controlled rage. I didn't have to look to know it was him. My husband had somehow figured out we were gone, somehow tracked us here, somehow found us before we could escape. Mama? Tommy's voice was small and scared, picking up on my terror. It's okay, baby, I lied, scanning the station for another way out. But we were trapped. The bus was our only exit, and to get to it, we'd have to walk right past where my husband was now storming through the station entrance. He looked like a man possessed, still in his work clothes but disheveled, his face dark with fury, his eyes scanning the crowd like a predator hunting prey. When those eyes found mine across the crowded terminal, I felt my knees go weak with terror. "Virginia!" His voice cut through the noise of the station like a blade. "Get over here, now!" Every instinct I'd developed over 5 years of marriage told me to obey. To walk over to him with my head down, accept whatever punishment was coming, and return to our life of quiet desperation. Tommy was already shrinking against me, recognizing his father's tone even from across the room. But then Roy Patterson stepped between us and my husband, and I realized I wasn't alone anymore. "Sir, I think you need to calm down," Roy said in that steady voice that came from years of dealing with difficult situations. "Get out of my way, old man. That's my wife and my son. They don't look like they want to go with you." My husband's laugh was ugly and dangerous. "I don't care what they want. They're my family, and they're coming home." The confrontation was drawing attention now. Other travelers were stopping to stare. Station security was moving in our direction, and I realized this was my moment. The only chance I'd ever get. "Tommy," I whispered, "remember that game we talked about? It's time to run." And run we did. While my husband argued with Roy and the growing crowd of concerned bystanders, I grabbed Tommy's hand and we sprinted toward our bus. The driver was already starting to close the doors, but he saw us coming and held them open. "Please," I gasped, practically throwing our tickets at him. "Please, we have to get on this bus." Behind us, I could hear my husband shouting, pushing through the crowd, getting closer with every second. But the bus driver looked at my face, looked at Tommy's terrified expression, and made a decision that probably saved our lives. "Get on," he said. "Find seats, now." We stumbled up the steps just as my husband broke free from the crowd. Through the bus window, I watched him run toward us, his face twisted with rage, and something else, not of line. Genuine panic at the thought of losing his control over us. He reached the bus, just as it started pulling away from the platform. For one horrible moment, our eyes met through that window. 5 years of marriage, of fear, of walking on eggshells and making excuses and watching my son's light dim a little more each day. All of it passing between us in that single look. Then the bus turned the corner, and he was gone. Tommy was crying now, silent tears that broke my heart, but also told me he understood, somehow, that we'd crossed a line we could never uncross. "Are we safe now, Mama?" he whispered. I held him close as Buffalo disappeared behind us, and the highway stretched ahead toward Ohio, toward my mother, toward a future I couldn't even imagine. "Yes, baby," I said. And for the first time in years, I wasn't lying. "We're safe now." But even as I said it, I knew our nightmare wasn't over. It was just beginning. Because men like my husband don't give up easily. And he knew exactly where we were going. The bus ride to Columbus felt like traveling through a dream, where safety kept slipping away just when you thought you'd grasped it. Tommy fell asleep against my shoulder somewhere outside Cleveland, his little body finally relaxing after months of constant vigilance. But I couldn't close my eyes. Every time we stopped, every time new passengers got on, I expected to see his face. My mother was waiting at the Columbus station with tears streaming down her cheeks and arms opened wide enough to hold all our broken pieces. She looked older than I remembered, more fragile. But when she wrapped us both in that fierce hug that smelled like vanilla and safety, I finally let myself believe we might actually be free. "Oh, my babies," she kept saying, over and over. "My poor babies. You're safe now. You're home." Home. I'd forgotten what that word really meant. For 2 weeks, we lived in a bubble of healing. Tommy started smiling again. Tentative little smiles at first, like he wasn't sure he was allowed, then bigger ones, when he realized nobody was going to punish him for being happy. My mother spoiled him rotten with cookies and bedtime stories and all the gentle love he'd been starved of for years. I called Roy Patterson to let him know we'd arrived safely, and he gave me news that should have been comforting but somehow wasn't. "Your husband came by the house the day after you left," Roy said, demanding to know where I'd sent you. When I wouldn't tell him, he got aggressive. I had to call the sheriff. "What did the sheriff do?" There was a pause that told me everything. "Talked to him, told him to calm down. Your husband showed him his military medals, talked about his service, how worried he was about his family." Sheriff seemed to think it was just a domestic misunderstanding. Of course he did. My husband had always been good at playing the concerned father and devoted veteran when outsiders were watching. It was behind closed doors where the mask came off. Roy, you need to be careful. If he thinks you helped us, don't you worry about me. I can handle myself. But Virginia, men like your husband, they don't just give up. You need to be prepared for the possibility that he'll come looking. I knew Roy was right, but I tried to push those fears away. We were 3 states away from Buffalo, living under my maiden name with my mother, trying to build some kind of normal life. Surely distance and time would make him give up eventually. I should have known better. The knock came at 2 a.m. on a Tuesday night, 3 weeks after we'd arrived in Columbus. Sharp, authoritative raps on my mother's front door that made my blood freeze in my veins. Tommy was asleep upstairs, and my mother was in her room, but I knew immediately who was standing on our porch. Police, open up. My hands were shaking as I unlocked the door to find 2 Columbus police officers on the step, their flashlights cutting through the darkness. Behind them, barely visible in the shadows, stood my husband, Mrs. The older officer consulted his notepad. Mrs. Virginia Wells? That's my maiden name, I said carefully. Matthews, what's this about? Ma'am, we have a report of kidnapping. This gentleman says you took his son without permission, and he's been searching for you for weeks. I looked past the officers to where my husband stood, and the smile on his face made my skin crawl. He'd found us. Somehow, impossibly, he'd tracked us down and convinced the police that he was the victim in all of this. Officers, there's been a misunderstanding. No misunderstanding, my husband interrupted, stepping forward. This is my wife and my son. She took him from our home in New York without my knowledge or consent. I've been worried sick. The younger officer looked uncomfortable. Ma'am, is this your husband? Yes, but... And is the child inside his son? Yes, but you don't understand. I understand perfectly, my husband said, his voice taking on that wounded tone I knew so well. My wife has been having some difficulties. Mental health issues. I think the stress of military life, moving around, it's been hard on her. I just want to get her the help she needs and bring my boy home where he belongs. Mental health issues. Of course, the perfect explanation for why a wife might run away with her child. Not abuse, not terror, not a mother protecting her son from a father who was slowly destroying him. Just a crazy woman who couldn't handle military life. Ma'am, the older officer said, his tone gentler now but still authoritative. We're going to need to see the child. Make sure he's safe. This was my worst nightmare playing out in real time. Tommy asleep upstairs, peaceful for the first time in years, about to be woken up and dragged back into hell. And there was nothing I could do to stop it, because the system, the very system that was supposed to protect children, was about to hand him right back to his abuser. Please, I begged, knowing how desperate I sounded. You don't understand what kind of man he island, what he's done to Tommy. The basement, the punishments, the rules. Virginia, sweetheart, my husband said in that patient, loving voice that had fooled so many people over the years. You're not well. You're imagining things that didn't happen. The officers exchanged glances, and I could see them making up their minds. Here was a decorated veteran, calm and reasonable, worried about his mentally unstable wife who'd kidnapped their child. And here was a hysterical woman making wild accusations with no proof to back them up. Let's go wake the boy, the older officer decided. See what he has to say. We climbed the stairs to Tommy's room, this terrible parade of people about to shatter my son's newfound peace. My mother had woken up and was hovering in her doorway, her face pale with understanding of what was happening. Tommy was curled up in his little bed, clutching his stuffed rabbit, looking so small and innocent in the moonlight streaming through the window. When the officer's flashlight hit his face, he woke up with a start. Immediately alert, in that way children learn when their survival depends on reading danger quickly. His eyes found his father, and I watched every bit of progress we'd made over the past 3 weeks crumble in an instant. Daddy? His voice was small, confused, terrified. Hello, son, my husband said, his tone warm and loving for the officer's benefit. I've been looking everywhere for you. Are you ready to come home? Tommy's eyes darted to me, then back to his father, then to the strange men in uniforms standing in his temporary sanctuary. I could see him trying to process what was happening, why Daddy was here, why the police were in Grandma's house. "I like it here," he said quietly. "Grandma makes cookies." My husband's laugh was full of paternal indulgence. "Of course she does. But we have our own home, remember? Your own room, your own toys. Daddy missed you so much." "Are you going to put me in the scary place again?" Tommy asked, and my heart clenched at the hope and fear warring in his voice. But my husband was ready for this. "What scary place, buddy? You mean your bedroom? I know it was hard sleeping in a new house, but you'll get used to it again." The officers bought it completely. Of course they did. A confused little boy talking about a scary place that his father reasonably interpreted as adjustment difficulties in a new home. They had no context for understanding what that scary place really was. No reason to dig deeper when the surface explanation made perfect sense. "Well," the older officer said, "everything seems to be in order here. Sir, you'll need to work out the custody arrangements through proper legal channels, but for now, it looks like this is indeed your son." "Thank you, officers. I really appreciate your help in finding my family." And just like that, it was over. My husband left that night with Tommy, and a promise that we'd work things out once I'd gotten the help I needed. The officers made some notes about domestic issues and mental health concerns, then drove away into the darkness, probably congratulating themselves on reuniting a father with his son. I stood on my mother's porch, watching their taillights disappear, knowing I'd just failed at the one job that mattered most, protecting my child. "This isn't over," my mother said fiercely, putting her arm around my shaking shoulders. "We'll find another way." But as I stared into that empty darkness where my son had vanished, I wondered if there was another way. The system had failed us completely. The police, who were supposed to protect and serve, had just delivered a 5-year-old boy back into the hands of his abuser because his abuser wore medals and spoke in calm, reasonable tones. My husband had won this round, but I wasn't giving up, even if it meant going to war against everyone. The police, the courts, the whole system that protected men like him, while sacrificing children like Tommy. Because Roy Patterson had been right about one thing: men like my husband never give up. Well, neither do mothers like me. The real fight was just beginning. What I'm about to tell you next might be hard to believe, but I swear on my grandson's life that every word is true. Sometimes the system fails you so completely that you have to become your own justice. Sometimes saving your child means breaking laws that were never designed to protect children in the first place. For 3 months after the Columbus police handed Tommy back to his father, I lived in a special kind of hell. My mother and I called lawyers, social services, anyone who would listen. We filed reports, made complaints, begged people to investigate. But my husband was smart, smarter than I'd given him credit for. He'd learned from our escape. No more basement punishments where neighbors might notice. No more obvious bruises or injuries that could be documented. Instead, he registered Tommy for school in Buffalo and played the role of devoted single father whose mentally unstable wife had abandoned them. The few times I managed to get someone official to check on Tommy, they found a clean house, a well-fed child, and a decorated veteran who spoke eloquently about doing his best to raise his son alone after his wife's breakdown. Tommy looked fine to them. Thin, maybe. Quiet, certainly. But some children were just naturally reserved, weren't they? And his father seemed so concerned, so loving, so committed to providing stability after the trauma of his mother's abandonment. That's the story they heard. That's the story they believed. But Roy Patterson was still watching, and what he saw told a different story entirely. "The boy's not right," he told me during one of our secret phone calls. "I see him sometimes when your husband takes him to town. Walks like he's afraid of his own shadow. Doesn't play, doesn't laugh, barely speaks unless someone asks him a direct question. Can you get close enough to talk to him? I've tried. Your husband watches him like a hawk, never lets him out of sight, never leaves him with anyone else. It's like he knows Tommy might tell someone the truth if he got the chance." The truth. That's what it all came down to. Tommy's truth against his father's lies, and a 5-year-old's word against a war hero's reputation. The breakthrough came from an unexpected source. Dr. Martinez, the The young doctor who'd treated Tommy for hypothermia that terrible night had been haunted by our case. Something about the way Tommy had clung to me, the fear in his eyes, the too perfect explanation his father had given, it all felt wrong in ways he couldn't shake. So he did something doctors aren't supposed to do. He started asking questions. He talked to other emergency room staff who'd treated military families. He researched post-traumatic stress in veterans and how it sometimes manifested in domestic violence. He even reached out to social services in other states, looking for patterns. What he found was a trail of incidents. Complaints that had been dismissed, reports that had been buried, other wives who'd tried to get help and been told they were overreacting or imagining things. All involving Vietnam veterans with exemplary service records and medals to prove their character. Dr. Martinez called me on a Thursday evening in February, 6 months after we'd been separated. "Mrs. Wells, I believe I have enough evidence to request a formal investigation into your husband's treatment of your son. But I need you to know, this is going to get ugly. He'll fight back with everything he has." "What kind of evidence?" "Medical records showing a pattern of suspicious injuries in children of certain veterans. Testimony from other wives who've tried to report abuse. And something else. Something that might be the key to everything." My heart was pounding so hard I could barely hear him. "What?" "Your husband's military records, the real ones, not the sanitized version he shows people. There were incidents in Vietnam, Mrs. Wells, bad incidents involving prisoners and civilians. He's not the hero he pretends to be." The plan Dr. Martinez proposed was risky beyond words. We would need to get Tommy alone, away from his father's watchful eye, long enough for a proper medical and psychological evaluation. We would need documented evidence of abuse. I am not just my word against his, but physical proof that couldn't be dismissed or explained away. Most importantly, we would need Tommy to be brave enough to tell his story to strangers, to relive his trauma for a room full of adults who would decide his fate based on how believable a 6-year-old could be under pressure. "There's something else," Dr. Martinez said quietly. "The investigation will require Tommy to testify before a grand jury. Are you prepared for what that might do to him?" I closed my eyes, thinking of my little boy's serious face, his careful movements, the way he'd started to laugh again during those few precious weeks in Columbus. Asking him to face his father in a courtroom, to tell strangers about the basement and the rules and the fear that had shaped his entire life. "What happens if I say no?" I asked. "Your husband keeps custody. Tommy grows up in that house, under those rules, learning that might makes right and fear is love. Eventually, he either breaks completely or becomes just like his father. The choice wasn't really a choice at all. What do you need me to do?" The plan was intricate and dangerous and probably illegal in about 6 different ways. Roy Patterson would create a distraction, a supposed emergency at his property that would require my husband's help as a neighbor. During that window, I would slip into the house through the back door. Roy still had a spare key from when he'd checked on the property after Mrs. Patterson's death and get Tommy out. But instead of running this time, instead of another desperate escape that would only buy us temporary freedom, we would go straight to the authorities. To Dr. Martinez, to the district attorney he'd convinced to take another look at our case, to people who finally understood that this wasn't about a custody dispute or a wife's mental health. This was about a child's life. The day we chose was a Saturday in March. Snow was still on the ground, but spring was fighting its way through winter, and maybe that felt symbolic somehow, like hope breaking through despair. I sat in Roy's truck at the end of the road, watching my husband's house through binoculars, waiting for the signal. At exactly 2 p.m., smoke started rising from Roy's barn. Not enough to cause real damage, but enough to look like an emergency that would require immediate help. 15 minutes later, my husband's truck roared past us, heading toward Roy's property at top speed. "Go," Roy said simply. I ran across that frozen yard faster than I'd ever moved in my life, my heart hammering so hard I thought it might kill me before I reached the back door. The spare key turned easily in the lock, and suddenly I was inside the house where my nightmare had begun. It looked exactly the same. The same furniture, the same oppressive atmosphere, the same list of rules still hanging on the refrigerator like some twisted family motto. But it felt different now. Smaller, somehow. like my fear had made it larger than it really was. "Tommy?" I called softly. I found him in his room, sitting on his bed reading a book, or pretending to read it, since I could see it was upside down. When he looked up and saw me, his face went through a dozen emotions in as many seconds. Joy, confusion, fear, hope, terror. "Mama?" His voice was barely a whisper. "Are you real?" I gathered him into my arms, and he felt so small, so fragile, like he'd been disappearing piece by piece in the months we'd been apart. "I'm real, baby, and I'm here to take you somewhere safe." "Where's Daddy?" "He's helping Roy with something. We don't have much time." Tommy pulled back to look at my face, and I saw something in his eyes that broke my heart and made me proud at the same time. Determination. My 6-year-old son had learned to be brave in ways no child should ever have to learn. "Are the police going to take me back to him again?" he asked. "Not this time. This time, we're going to tell them the truth, and they're going to listen." "What if they don't believe me?" I cupped his face in my hands, looking into those eyes that had seen too much, understood too much, survived too much. "Then we'll keep telling the truth until someone does." "But Tommy, you have to be very brave. You have to tell them about the basement, about the rules, about everything that happened here. Can you do that?" He nodded solemnly. "I can be brave, Mama. I learned how." And that's how my 6-year-old son became the hero of our story. 3 weeks later, Tommy sat in a courtroom and told 12 strangers about living in fear, about being locked in basements, about learning that love and pain were the same thing. He spoke clearly, calmly, truthfully, while his father sat across the room watching with eyes full of rage. The grand jury took less than an hour to hand down an indictment for felony child abuse. Tommy and I moved to Iowa under new identities, started a life where laughter was allowed and mistakes were forgiven, and bedtime stories ended with happily ever after instead of lectures about discipline and strength. My husband served 4 years in prison. When he got out, he tried to find us, but we'd learned how to disappear properly this time. Now, I'm 85 years old, telling this story to you because someone needs to know that monsters don't always look like monsters. Sometimes they look like heroes. Sometimes they wear medals and uniforms and speak about honor while destroying the people they're supposed to protect. But I also want you to know that escape is possible. That there are good people in the world who will help if you're brave enough to ask. That children are stronger than we think, and love is stronger than fear. And the truth, no matter how long it takes, always finds a way to shine through the darkness. Tommy grew up to be a teacher. He works with troubled children, kids who've seen too much and survived too much, just like he did. He married a wonderful woman, had 3 beautiful children of his own, and broke the cycle of violence that could have destroyed our family forever. If this story sounds familiar, if you recognize yourself or someone you love in these words, please remember, you are not alone. Help is out there, and you are stronger than you know. Thank you for listening to my story. If it touched your heart, if it made you think, if it maybe even helped someone who needed to hear it, please hit that like button. Leave a comment telling me your thoughts, and don't forget to subscribe for more stories that matter. Because stories have power, and sometimes power is exactly what someone needs to change their life. Until next time, remember, the truth is worth fighting for, and love is always stronger than fear.